Hey guys, today we're going to take a look at forms in AngularJS and form validation in AngularJS. So over here on the left, I've got a basic HTML page lined up. I've got Angular included. I've got it wired up or bootstrapped with ng app. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drop a form on the page. So just a basic form. I'm going to load that up in the browser here. And what you're going to notice is right off the bat, it already has this weird class of ng pristine and ng valid. And the reason is that when you put a form on the page, Angular is actually overwriting it with a form directive. So it's overwritten the form with its own form directive, and it's going to do that with any nested inputs as well. And you see here, again, it's ng pristine and ng valid. The form itself and any inputs have four basic states. And the first one is pristine, which is, it's a fresh form. Nobody's changed anything. The user hasn't entered anything. The next one is dirty, or ng dirty, and that means that, the user changed something. ng valid means that the form itself is valid or the input is valid, and then ng invalid is going to be, it's invalid. So let's mess with this a little bit. So one thing about the form directive is you always want to give everything a name. It's a way that you can reference everything else. So we're just going to call this FRM. I'm going to drop an input here, and I'm going to make it an email type. I'm going to give a name of email, and I'll give it a ng model of, we'll say user.email. And as soon as I drop that on the page, what you can see here is the input itself also gets these values. So ng pristine, ng valid, and ng valid email. Now, as soon as I type something here, what you're going to see is it's ng dirty. Also on the form itself, it's ng dirty. And you're going to see ng invalid, and that's because it's an invalid email. So this is using a directive from Angular that knows that we are anticipating an email, and it knows that there's no email in there. So as soon as I type an actual, something that might be an email, you can see now we have ng valid email. So what we're going to do really quick is let's drop a little style on this so we can take advantage of those styles. So let's start with ng invalid. And we'll just say, what are we going to do? So let's say a border of 1 pixel solid red. Now, as soon as I load this up, whoops, that's not right. ng invalid. You know what? Everything's valid at that point. So let me give it some form of validation. The first one I'm going to use is required to say like, hey, this one is required. And as soon as I load that up, you can see we've got these two red borders, and that's because both the form and the input. So the form overall has the ng valid. You'll see now it also has this ng valid, invalid required, and same thing on the input itself. It's got invalid required, and invalid email. So as soon as I start to type in here, the ng valid required comes into place on both of them. But since it still needs an email, now everything goes away. Everything is ng valid required. The whole thing is valid itself, and we've got the valid email. And that's one good instance where you really want to use this on the input itself. So now we don't have it all, over the form, but it still needs to be an email. So there you go. Okay, so what we could do here, let's drop a message on the page. So let's throw this into a div, and this is purely for layout. It's certainly not required. Span, oops, let's move that on to the next line. And here we're going to say, hey, it's required. And what we can do is we can use ng show on that. And the first thing we can do is just say if it's invalid. And this is where the names come into play. So we say, here's our form, and then the name of the field is email, and we can tap into the invalid method. And so it says it's required, and it's going to keep on doing that until I put an actual email address on that, because that's when it becomes valid rather than invalid. So as a whole, it's invalid. But one way we can kind of work around that, because maybe I want to say, hey, it's required, and then I want to say, hey, I can see you're doing something, but I need an email. So rather than just using invalid, we can use error, and then we can tap into a specific error. So this one is required, and now as soon as I start to type, the required message goes away. Now the field itself still has the ng invalid there, but let's go ahead and add another message below that, and we'll say not an email. Oh, email. And so here we can tap into the email error. So load that, and now it's saying it's not an email. So as soon as it's gone, we're back to required. As soon as I type something, it's saying, okay, you passed the required validation, but we need an email. Now you're good to go. Okay, so that's pretty cool. Let's do one more input before we move on to the form itself. So on this one, we're gonna make this one a password. So type of password, we'll make the name password, and we'll make the model user.password. Of course it's required, and down here, let's tap into that, so it's required. And the password, well, no, the email one doesn't make any sense. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to break this one out a little bit so we can see it on the screen a little better. Just each of these attributes on its own line. And I'm going to add a couple others. So the first one I'm going to use is ng-min length. So that's we're asking for a minimum length. So I'm going to say the minimum length is 5. And then I'm going to add on a max length. So you can't go over 10. And then just like we did, and let me kind of stretch this out a little bit so we can see everything here. Just like we did for the required, we can say the error is min length, and there we'll say it's too short. And then if we say max length, now we're going to say it's too long. Okay, so let's load that up really quick. So this is required. It needs to be an email. Down here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's perfect. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 is good. And once I hit 11, it's too long. Okay, so both of those are working just as we expected. However, when we load up the page, we're getting these red boxes, and it's yelling at me. I didn't even do anything wrong. So let's first I'm going to drop a label on each of these just so it looks a little better. So this one's for email, and this one's for password. Let's just load that up really quick. Okay, so it needs an email, it needs a password. It's yelling at me all the time. And this is where we can tap into the dirty state. So what we could do is we could say, let me just copy this really quick. So form.email.$dirty, and then a double and. So we want both of these to be the issue. So that would mean that the user has to enter something before the web page starts yelling at them. So let's drop this there, and this there. So now you can see, and let me stretch out a little bit more. So you can see that we're checking for, oh, this one should be password actually. Let's tweak that really quick. Password, and password. Okay. So now what we can do is we can load this up, and it is invalid. So, I do need to address that. So what I'm going to say is that the input needs to be invalid and dirty. That way, when we load it up, so we've got a fresh page here, nothing's happened, and it's not yelling at me. Now, as soon as I type it in, it is saying, hey, it's not an email, but whatever. Now, when I get to the password, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we're good. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, too long. So that's a much better experience rather than just loading up and being, hey, you haven't filled all this stuff in. So now we can look at the form itself. So let's just throw on a button here. Call it send, or no, let's call it, or say we're going to log on, whatever. And now what we'll do is we'll disable that if the entire form is invalid. So we can just say ng disabled equals, and then all we got to say is form dot invalid. So now we can use this kind of overall everything's invalid or something in there is invalid, so the entire form is invalidated. Now when we load this up, you can see this button is totally disabled. It's still disabled. Well, So now we've got a good email, but it's still disabled because we need the password. And now it's enabled. I can click on that, but if I go too far, now it's too long and it's disabled again. So there's a couple more things I might follow up on. One of them is going to be in ng submit. Submit equals, and you can call a function, you know, from your controller or your code. But I think that's pretty good for now. So that's a quick look at how awesome the form directive is and all the inputs that you can tap in there. You can just get right in there and start working all this validation stuff without having to code up, you know, a whole bunch of things or bring in an extra library. It's all just built right into Angular. So there you go. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Have a good one.